Good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing this evening?
Fine.
Good. Get some feedback. That's great. So good evening. We're back again for our Armenian Studies Program lecture series. Tonight, Ara Sarafian from London, England, will be speaking about the Armenians in Ottoman Turkey. It's based on a work by Dr. Sarkis-Karayan. Tonight's presentation is co-sponsored by the Armenian Studies Program and also the Leon S. Peters Foundation, which provides support for our lecture series. Before I introduce Ara and tell you a little bit more about tonight's presentation, I'd like to just remind you about some of the events that you are seeing that were coming through. Next Thursday night, Dr. Richard Hovhannisyan from UCLA, USC, and Chapman University will be speaking about Armenia, the Daring Adventure, 1918 to 2018, and he'll be speaking at the Charles and Alice Gurelian Armenian Community Center in downtown Fresno. So it's not at this venue next Thursday night, but it will start at 7:30 p.m. All of you are invited to attend. Then Friday night, on November the 2nd, we're going to be showing the movie Roots at our other educational center in the Save Mart Center. And we're bringing Lilit Martirosyan from Armenia. She's the producer of the movie. This is our annual Cineculture movie done in conjunction with them. And these are always really interesting movies. We invite all of you to come. It's free, and there's free parking on Friday night. And then the 2 weeks following, we'll have our final lecture on November the 6th by Dr. Umit Kurt, who's been here all semester as our visiting professor. And then finally on November the 13th, we're going to have Ani Hovhannisyan as a producer of a movie called The Hidden Map of the Armenians. And she will be here with explorer Stephen Sim. He's of Scottish origin, but he spent the last 30 years in Turkey exploring places where Armenians lived. It's going to be a very interesting presentation. They're also going to be presenting a short video of their work. That will be in this venue on Tuesday, November the 13th. It is on our website and also on our Facebook page. And we also have flyers if you're interested, and make sure to put that on your schedule. So tonight, our guest speaker is once again Ara Sarafian. He's the director of the Gomidas Institute, which is based in London, England. He's been a frequent visitor to our campus, and he usually comes when he's published a new book. And today, the book is called Armenians in Ottoman Turkey, 1914. Just want to show you this massive volume, 674 pages. It was written by Dr. Sarkis-Karayan, and it documents over 4,000 Armenian inhabited towns and villages of historic Armenia prior to the destruction of 1915. Dr. Karayan was a physician by trade, practice, but he also was a very meticulous historian, and he put together this volume. And after our lecture today, the volume will be out in the front. You can take a look at it if you're interested in purchasing it, but I really recommend it, especially for those of you that are doing genealogical research. You want to find out where your roots are from. This book will help you discover that. This presentation, the book is full of really meticulous data and all kinds of material, including maps and the old and new names for villages. So oftentimes in Turkey, the names of older Armenian village names have been changed to Turkish. I'm not going to tell you more about the book because Ara Sarafian is here to do that. He has been publishing many, many books over the past few years, many of them on the Armenian genocide, including books such as Talat Pasha's Black Book on the Armenian genocide and the treatment of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, 1915 to 1916. He's also published a very interesting memoir by the former U.S. ambassador to Armenia, John Evans. This was published several years ago, about Ambassador Evans' experience with first using the word genocide as an official of the United States government and the consequences. So we have a great evening in store for us, and without any further introduction, I'd like to introduce our guest, Ara Sarafian. Ara.
First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for today's event and you for being here. I was in Turkey beginning of September. I went to the Akşamlar church service, and as I was there, I said, you know, it'd be interesting to find a village of Hirj. Hirj was a village where, in many ways, the Armenian genocide was first major incident of the Armenian genocide took place in Van when the Turkish authorities killed the Armenian leader, Ishkhan. What was interesting is that all I had to do was look at Dr. Karayan's work, figure out what the village of Hirj was called today. I look on a Google map, I typed in the name, I had a car, I just drove there in 10 minutes, right? If you didn't have that information, even though the village is very close to Ottoman, you wouldn't be able to find it. So this is just a little example of why a publication such as this is important. Because much of our history, much of modern Armenian history has been expunged in Turkey, not only with the physical destruction of places, of the material culture, whether it's churches, cemeteries, what have you, but even the names. The name of Armenians, Armenian villages have been erased in a political exercise of writing Armenians out of the history of modern day Turkey. That's why if you were to go to the Museum of Van, there's a new one now, there's no mention of Armenians. If you went to the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations in Ankara, the capital, there's no such thing as Armenian civilizations, they never existed. And you realize that states manufacture histories, or they write people out, as well as writing false accounts of other people. And Turkish historiography is politicized along these lines. And this is a current against which we are working as historians, as Armenian historians, and the sort of work that we're doing including here matters. It matters because if we don't write our own history, we'll either have no history at all, like many people who have no written histories, as if they never existed, or our opponents will write alternative versions, shall we say, and in a sense we will not exist. I often think of Assyrians. I have many Assyrian friends. Assyrians, very little is known about their history. There are Assyrians in Fresno. They fared much as the Armenians did. They've never really recovered. Only recently have some young scholars that are working on Assyrian history. It's as if Assyrians never existed in the Ottoman Empire, right? And over 100,000 of them were destroyed in the Van region. They never wrote their own history. Maybe that'll change in years to come. We don't know. So this Dr. Karayan, he was a physician, a very good man, a very meticulous worker, and one of his life's work over the years, and people sort of almost ridiculed him, I put it crudely, because of the work he did. Now, what is the subject matter of his work? This is a map of Armenians just before World War I. The red dots show you the distribution of Armenians in Ottoman Empire, what is modern-day Turkey. The green is the Caucasus, where many Armenians did survive, but there's not more to be said. And I put the blue ones because in northwestern Iran, excuse me, because there were also Armenians living there before World War I too. In the course of the First World War, where we talk about the Armenian genocide and destruction of Armenians, the red dots were pretty much erased. They did not exist. And that is the sort of the visual representation of the Armenian genocide. When the Turkish Republic was created, as I mentioned earlier, the memory of Armenians, the word Armenians was erased, and modern-day Turkey came up with an alternative version of the history of this landmass. So how did Dr. Sarkis Karayan's work start? Sarkis Karayan, while in Lebanon, was asked a very basic question by a Stanley Kerr, an American, which said, how do we know 1.5 million Armenians were killed in 1915? Right? That's actually a very interesting question, because that's a figure that's often used. It's used as a convention. But if you were to say, but how do we know 1.5 million Armenians were killed? And Dr. Karayan's investigation started with in an effort to give an honest answer to Dr. Kerr. And in order to do so, Dr. Karayan explains, he had to first figure out, well, how many Armenians were there in the Ottoman Empire before 1915? Well, how do we know that? And you realize how much of our history is written on hearsay or on repetition rather than scholarship. And that propelled him to start his investigation. He said, in order to know how many Armenians were murdered or were lost in the genocide, you have to know how many of them were living in 1914, and say how many of them were living in this case, 1923-25, and then accounting for that drop in numbers, and accounting for that drop in numbers in terms of how many were killed between 15 and 18, and subsequent period. And Dr. Karayan's quest started with a very basic question. And you might say, well, what's the obvious place to start? Well, the obvious place one might think would be, well, what do Turkish archives say? What do the archives of the Ottoman Empire say, after all? And this is the area where the Ottoman Empire was based. And Dr. Karayan went through a set of records. He went through Turkish historiography based on Ottoman records. He had to come up with alternative sources, Armenian sources, and that's the important part. What are the Armenian sources? What kind of Armenian sources are there? Foreign, non-Armenian, non-Turkish, a lot of travelers who went through this area. And he had to make an evaluation and account for the material evidence. Well, how do you make sense of this material? And in the beginning of his work, he came up with this particular explanation. He says, until 1878, which is this particular point, Ottoman records, Turkish records, actually claim or accounted for about 2.4 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. 2.4 million. After this crucial date, 1878, when the Armenian issue became internationalized, because Armenians started asking for civil rights, official Turkish sources, the Turkish state in the Ottoman Empire, dropped the numbers. All right? The number of Armenians comes down right down to about 800,000, 1.2 million, according to Ottoman Turkish historiography. According to Armenian sources, Dr. Karayan's, the number of Armenians actually was much higher, and part of his study was to explain the differences in these numbers. Now, according to Dr. Karayan, I'll jump ahead. When we say this is what Ottoman sources say, what does that mean? Right? Archives exist, archives have all kinds of materials in them. It does, but history doesn't write itself. And Dr. Karayan explains that starting in the 1980s and 1990s, when the Armenian genocide was very topical in the United States, a certain genre of Turkish historiography was exported from Turkey itself. A number of scholars in the United States started using what we call official archives in Turkey, started using Ottoman archival materials, a selection of specific Ottoman records, and using that material, they started arguing that there were never 1.5 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire to start off with. At most, Armenians numbered between 800,000 and 1.2 million, and this became a politicized historiography. And the key names were a cohort of scholars, or writers, I should say, Stanford Shaw at UCLA, and his students, Justin McCarthy, all right, and another professor, a Turkish professor further north, Kemal Karpat. Between them, they began using Ottoman records that were not open to other scholars, citing Ottoman records, in order to come with whole historiography in the English language to say there were never 1.5 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. And this is when you realize that the denial of Armenian history in Turkey, the Turkish Republic, was effectively also exported to the United States. History not only doesn't write itself, but states and governments and partisan groups have the capacity of manufacturing even false historical records based on the archives of countries at that time, like Turkey, who control the data, in order to argue what is essentially a political point. There were never 1.5 million Armenians, there were 1 million of them. And this was part of what we today call the denial of the Armenian genocide. It was in parallel with the Turkish government's arguments that the Armenian genocide was a false thesis, that the Armenians were never persecuted. In fact, there were never that many Armenians there in the first place. And these American scholars, American-based scholars, had some traction with their work, because nobody was actually arguing against them, because anybody who wanted to argue against them did not have access to the Ottoman records that they were citing in Turkey. And I may say that I was one of them by the 1990s. When I started probing this issue, I was kicked out of the Turkish archives. There's a whole story there. But it shows you how the politics of archives and history writing come together on this particular Armenian issue. So Dr. Karayan actually examines this historical, the Turkish position, and he gives a very good account. But arguing that Turkish historiography is unreliable on the Armenian issue still doesn't answer the question, well, okay, how many Armenians were there? And one of his fortes was that Dr. Karayan was probably the first scholar who actually identified a whole genre of Armenian language records, demographic records, that were never used, or that's even today, have never been used in a serious manner by even scholars. And he showed that at the same 1878, the Armenians themselves in the Ottoman Empire began counting themselves. The Armenian administration, based in Constantinople, started to commission reports, and the patriarch himself, but certainly by the late 1870s, to go into the provinces and to start this whole process of finding out where the Armenians were living and their numbers. Until that point, even Armenians didn't know what it was. It was backward to the Ottoman Empire. These are some of the records that Dr. Karayan dealt with in the first place. These are some Ottoman records that I'll explain later. And European records. This was a particular source by Vital Kine. It's called Turkidazi, Turkish in Asia, who for the first time used Turkish official sources in order to put some of this data into French. Dr. Karayan actually engages the French language material as part of his work to say that it's based on Ottoman records from that period, and he critiques it. And he critiques it in a very specific way. Just to give some of the obvious examples that he uses, we know that in Mardin, near Diyarbakir, there was an Armenian community there. And we also know that there were Catholic Armenians. There were not Apostolic Armenians. These were Catholic Armenians who were exiled there by the Apostolic community. Yet in Ottoman historiography, they're identified as Apostolic Armenians. In the case of Zeytun, these are the obvious glaring errors. So just to make a point, in the Zeytun area, all right, there's almost half of the population is shown to be Catholic Armenians. So not only are the numbers in question, but even the actual the nature, the congregation that they belong to were wrong. So what Karayan does is he critiques these historiographical records one by one. But still, because Armenians started collecting these records and publishing at the time, some of them were sort of quite innocent-looking volumes. This is from 1879, but yeah, this is Sarafian-Armenians one. It looks innocent enough, but Sarafian-Armenians was one of those Armenians who were sent to the provinces to go all the way down to Kharper with the Arash-Nortarans, and to come up with demographic information. And these works, going into several hundred pages, describe the Armenians of Kharpert and where they lived, and he describes how he moved from village to village and how the information was collected. And these the first reports in a published format are already coming up in the 1870s. By the beginning of 1915, Armenians start to have their own studies, and with the famous one by Ado, who wrote a publication called the Villages of Bitlis, Van, and Erzurum, where he noted over 1,000 Armenian settlements with their population. So Armenians had this ability of gathering their own sources. And what Karayan does is identify these materials, and of course after the genocide. After the genocide, as Armenians started recording their village histories, like the village of Kharpert, on specific villages, some of which and then publishing as book. Some of these sources were even published in Fresno too, give so much detail that there's nothing comparable in other languages. So if you want to know the profile of Armenians in the Kharpert area, you look at Kharpert in Vosketash that was published by Kharpertsis after the genocide. These are people who lost their communities, they survived the genocide, and they started recording their history. So in the case of Kayseri, it's a mammoth 2-volume, 3,000-page work on just that one area alone. This is very important because saying Turkish sources are unreliable doesn't tell you how we can come up with alternative figures. What Karayan did was he came up with 120 such studies going into tens of thousands of pages as alternative sources. And this was the first time that anybody not only put these volumes together, but he came up with a meticulous record. He counted over 4,000 such settlements. And what he did was not only did he identify the settlements themselves, but he identified it on the map, so putting them back onto the map that the Turkish authorities taken them off, and he identified the old and the new names. So this was also undoing what the Turkish state had done for 100 years, erasing the memory. What Karayan did was using these alternative sources, was putting Armenians back onto the map of modern-day Turkey in a way to reverse the attempts to eradicate the memory of Armenians. So one of the core of the work here is this list of 4,000 Armenian settlements, which Karayan had to generate in order to begin his calculations of how many Armenians were destroyed in 1915. Here's one example, the sort of material that exists in the Armenian language. It's Erzincan area. It was Sarafian-Armenians work. It's an incredible source which gives you a detail of where the different villages are in the Erzincan plain. These are the old names. You can actually use this map today to identify the same locations with a new name. So, and this shows you the sort of material that we have to work with. So we don't have to rely on Ottoman records, but the Armenian materials that we have at our fingertips. And then we have Russian records, and the French and British and military maps. So the material that we have are compelling. And another way of evaluating Karayan's work is to use sources that he never used. This is just one of them. This is a Russian source for the area of Bitlis and Van. This is the aggregate figures, but it shows you that how much of these areas, how many of these areas were actually not Turkish at all. They were either Kurdish or Armenian. The Armenians are the reds, the yellow ones are Kurdish, and there's also orange for the Assyrians, as I mentioned earlier. So these alternative sources, this information will not exist in any Turkish textbooks. They don't, because the Turkish state denies Armenian history and it also denies Kurdish history. This is not something that they would allow to be published. In fact, according to this map, the only sort of Kurdish population are these gray areas. So this area was overwhelmingly either Armenian or either Kurdish. So it shows you what alternative sources are available to us. And what Dr. Karayan didn't have, and this is where my work comes in, is that Armenians were so sophisticated by the end of the First World War that in 1913, they actually did their own census. The Armenian Patriarchate was organized enough to send census forms to the interior provinces where they see the names of the villages, and these are columns of data. The number of Armenian Apostolic community, Armenian Catholic, Armenian Protestant, the Protestant, and the number of households, the number of students, number of Bantuks. Bantuks are this column here. The number of people who are away from the village, elsewhere, workers. Many of them are actually identified to be in the United States. So for the Kharkiv area, there are Armenians who emigrated to the United States, but they are still registered in Kharkiv because that's where they left from. So this data is actually very, very interesting. So it shows you that although the Turkish state controls Ottoman archives, it controls what kind of information those archives can lead, that can be seen or cannot be seen. What they can't control are the alternative sources, including this particular survey that was done by the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople. We're very lucky that these survey returns were smuggled out of Turkey in 1918, and they are in Paris today. All right, and this allows us to challenge Turkish historians, and when we talk about numbers and how many Armenians are there, it is also based on archival evidence And this evidence is particularly interesting because Dr. Karayan, when he did his work, he did not have access to this material. So when I evaluate his work, I'm evaluating not only in terms of what he says about his work, but also because I, as a historian, had the reference to the 1913 census itself. Okay, so this is part of the historian's job. This is one more exciting. This is what makes history interesting and exciting, is that this year I was in Yerevan, and I started working in archives, and lo and behold, in Yerevan are the archival originals of the first Armenian surveys in the 1870s. Now, the 1870 information was published in books. You always wonder, well, how do we know the books did not take license, did not change the figures, and so forth? And in Yerevan, Armenia today, you can find the original demographic data that was collected in 1878, 1779, that was sent to the Patriarchate, that informed those books, and now we can actually compare the published records with the archival original. It is incredible how much original Armenian language sources there are, and it's incredible how much more forcefully we are able today to present our own thesis that counters what the Turkish state is trying to erase. This is for Harpert, and from 1878, the 1878 data not only gives you the data about Armenians living there, but also non-Armenian villages in detail. And I haven't seen anything comparable in the Turkish language. So this is, to me, in starting a study of that area, the Armenian language records, which we assume were lost because of the genocide, because of that these records were lost. Fortunately, a lot of it were not lost, and they were smuggled out of Turkey, and there is troves of information at our fingertips that we can now integrate into our historical account. So it makes Armenian history writing process itself more interesting. It means that there's a lot more to be said on these subjects in order to argue our case. This is just a page from the book, what it looks like. The 1913 census I took, and I turned it into a map. So we have the data that's the population breakdown. In this case, what I did was I put the data in the main bar, the pie charts. Each pie chart is a specific village. The red represents Armenian Apostolic. If I'm not mistaken, the purple represents Catholic. The greens are Armenian Protestants, so there were a lot of Armenian Protestants in the Harpert area. And the gray area are the Turks. So when we talk about Armenians in Harpert before 1915, this is the type of detail that we can project onto the map of Turkey. Remember, the Turkish state has erased all this, and what we're doing are the reverse. This is a map of Armenians in the Harpert Plain. You might say, well, what's that blue stuff? Well, those are areas where, because the Turkish state has built dams, those villages are now underwater. Okay, that's why you have villages in the lakes. But we can still identify where they are. And for each location, we can tell them how many churches there are, how many boys and girls school, how many boys and girls by gender who went to those schools. So it gives you a certain ethnic profile of what size settlements Armenians lived in, and you can also compare from area to area. So for example, in the Bitlis area, you will notice that the villages might be smaller, Armenians are less mixed, it's pure Armenian villages. You'll notice that girls aren't being sent to school the way they're supposed to be. The overwhelming number of schooling is for boys, so it's more backwards in that sense. So it gives us all kinds of information. So now sort of digressing from Dr. Karayan's work into general demographics. Armenians on the eve of World War I. How do we know what we know? And the answer is because we, first and foremost, we have Armenian language records, reliable Armenian language records in print, as well as in archival form, that gives us this information. So one of my projects is to have Armenian settlements for the whole Ottoman Empire in a sort of visual format so that it's much more easier to absorb. So the end of it. So I now go back to the first question we were going to say, argue. Yes. So, how many Armenians perished in the First World War? According to Dr. Karayan, having done his work and having identified the 4,000 villages one by one, carefully footnoted. These were his findings. According to Karayan, before World War I, there were approximately 4.8 million Armenians total in worldwide Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the diaspora. The diaspora was at 240,000. Okay? According to Dr. Karayan, the total number worldwide between 1923 and 27, the number of Armenian lives were lost. He calculates the number of Armenians falls from 2.5. Oh, it's interesting. According to Karayan, there were 2.5 million Armenians in Ottoman Empire. That's almost twice, more than twice what the official figures say. So according to his figures, 2.5 million Armenians live in Ottoman Empire. This isn't by definition correct, but it's certainly a much more realistic figure. It's something we can argue about, but he has presented a thesis. He's arguing and he's telling you why those are the numbers. It's up to other scholars to argue with it. But according to him, there were 2.5 million Armenians, and the number falls down to, in Turkey itself, to 150,000, okay, by the early 1920s. Now, many of them escaped and survived. And according to his figures, the number of Armenians who eventually, total Armenian world, who died between 1920, who died during the First World War, is just over 2 million people. And I can see from here. And according to him, another further 400,000 perished after the genocide. They perished in Turkey itself during the Kemalist movement in Cilicia, but also in the Caucasus. As we know, with the collapse of the Russian Empire at the time and all the fighting that took place between Armenians and Azeris and Armenians and Turks, because the Turkish nationalists also attacked Armenia. According to him, the number of Armenian losses was 412,000. Okay, the number of Armenians lost during the First World War is about just over 2 million. And he says the total and the total number of Armenians, therefore, total number of losses, she would say, between 14 and 18, 2,185,000 people. Okay, that is a staggering figure, but it's the first time that anyone tried to put together a serious set of figures, both for the population for Armenians, but also for the loss of that number between 1915 and say 1925. I think people will argue about this, but there's no question that the Turkish figures are completely wrong. I actually always assumed it was closer to the Armenian population of Ottoman Empire was not even 2 million, but he's arguing with 2.5 million. And now I think this Dr. Karayan's study will become a new focus for Ottoman historians, because he goes in much greater detail to argue the case that he does. And the significance of his work is not simply for historiographical reasons, that is, how many Armenians were in the Ottoman Empire, or even how many died in genocide, but also, in a sense, for political reasons. Because his work now only exposes Turkish national historiography. It exposes the impact of Turkish denial of Armenian genocide at different levels, even in question of the demographic study. It undermines the Turkish state's efforts to erase the memory of Armenians in Turkey itself by identifying every single, as far as it's concerned, every single Armenian location, not only for Armenians but also Turks. So when I presented this similar talk in England, about a third of the audience was Turkish, and I realized that ordinary Turks themselves are interested, because they have also been denied this knowledge, because they have been indoctrinated for 100 years. When a Turkish state destroys the memory of Armenians, renames the villages, it's not simply to hurt survivors of the Armenian genocide, it's also part of a political exercise to indoctrinate modern-day Turks and tell them there were never Armenians here, these have always been Turkish lands. So Dr. Karayan's work has a significance, disruptive significance in a good way, within Turkey itself. So it'd be interesting to make a presentation such as this, because of its serious nature inside of Turkey. And I suspect that the data in this book is going to end up on wiki pages, so that young Turks living in a little village in Erzincan or Kharpet or Erzurum may simply type in their village name, and suddenly there's all this other information that the village had a different name 100 years earlier, that it had an Armenian population, that there were Armenian Christians there, and you can let the local Turks mull over the discrepancy between what they're told by their state and educational system on the one hand, and what appears to be a very different kind of narrative that's related to what they think is a false thesis of the Armenian genocide. So this type of work has historiographic but also political significance. And I think this is why I was interested in publishing this work, because what we'd like to do is now take this work to Turkey itself, is to make it, to donate it to Turkish libraries and possibly put it online as well. And so this is one way of countering or fighting back, as it were, the legacy of the denial of the Armenian genocide today to modern technology and scholarship, right? So, about the memory of a people who were destroyed. So Karayan's work only was released this week, and the future will say. But I believe from now on, when people write about the demography of the Ottoman Empire, they will have to take account of not only this work in its own right, but because this work exposes the faults of Turkish historiography and shows the existence of a whole range of Armenian language materials, Ottoman historians will be held more accountable for the Armenian language materials. You can't simply say it doesn't exist or we don't know about it, because Karayan, for the first time, if nothing else, is showing you the range of Armenian language sources that are available there today, and that Armenian is an essential language for Ottoman studies. If you want to talk about Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, you don't go to Ottoman archives, you go to Armenian sources, because they exist in print, all right, and because they are accessible. And this is a line that we should be pushing within academia, and frankly, if anyone is learning Armenian today, you can see its application. If you want to be a historian of the Ottoman Empire, Armenian is an invaluable language because it is relevant within the context of Ottoman studies. It's a bit of a pedantic talk, but it's an important talk. And these are the milestones. These are the building blocks of history writing. I'm sort of surprised that this type of information was not made available 50 years ago, but today we have an understanding of Ottoman Armenians that we didn't think was possible even 10 years ago. So Dr. Karayan has given and made a great service to Ottoman and Armenian and Ottoman studies, and the future will tell how much further that's going to go. I would like to stop here, and what we could do, the question and answer format, is either talking about the data and what it yields, or the context in which Turkish historiography has developed in Turkey, but also in the United States, and its implication. The whole history writing process is not self-regulating. You know, writing process can be abused. History writing process can be repressive, and there are lessons in there for us. Not just for Armenians, but even in this country. You know, you think of Native Americans and how little we know about them, or even the naming of places, right? You go, we have a very Anglo-Saxon names, but often that's a way of erasing the landscape of the native peoples. And then we can be much more critical in our understanding and maybe much more sympathetic to the oppressed peoples of the world. Thanks very much.
I'd like to thank Ara for that wonderful presentation and the very clear way that he showed us that Armenian sources are very valuable for the study of the Armenian genocide in a way that has not been publicized before. So as he said, I would like to open it up for questions. If you have specific questions regarding the book or about Ara Sarafian's research, you can raise your hand and we'll take some questions over here first, and then over here, and then over here. So Jane first.
Okay. Repeat the question.
How many Turks were there in Turkey in comparison to Armenian population? Let's just say, we know the Armenian data from Armenian sources, much harder to talk about Turkish sources. And when you say Turkish, that's also very difficult, because most Muslims in the Ottoman Empire would not necessarily call themselves Turks. They've been Turkified over the last 100 years. But at the time, they would be calling themselves Arabs or Bosnians or Cherkess. So they were Muslims. They were part of a Muslim community, and it's a Muslim community that became the Turkish community in modern day Turkey. That's why Turkey has a problem with Kurds, right? Because the Kurds were never assimilated. They were supposed to be assimilated, and in Turkish historiography they refer to the Kurds in the east as being the Muslims, but never Kurdish. But if you look at region, what proportion? If your question is what proportion were Armenians in these areas, Armenians were minorities. In very few places that they were actually majority. In the Van area, they were just over half. In places like Sivas had the largest number of Armenians in absolute terms, but there was an even larger number of Turks. So it'd be like Muslim, shall we say, 1/3 is Armenian, 2/3 is actually Muslim. So the Armenians lived as minorities in most part of the Ottoman Empire. And as you can see from this map, they're not limited to historic Armenia. Armenians outmigrated to other parts of the empire. The center of Armenia of the empire was Constantinople. That's where the intellectual class was, that's where the patriarchate was, that's where the big publishing houses were, the core was in the capitals. So the Armenians were dissipated, they were not concentrated, and they were not a majority anywhere. In fact, they were a minority. If you want to argue from a political perspective, you might say yes, but they may not be majority, but they could be the polity, which means you're not over 50%, but you're the largest group. Now that's more likely. If you divided the Muslim population amongst Turks and Kurds and Cherkess and whatnot, you find out that the Armenians are often the largest single group, but they're still not the majority, right? But that's a political issue. I mean, people who talk in terms of legitimacy. Somehow, if you're more than 50%, that gives you certain rights. I don't subscribe to that, but some people would argue along those lines. It matters. But for the most part, Armenians lived alongside other groups and Muslim groups, right? And according to Turkish historiography, but we're contending those figures, right? There were probably about 12 million. There were probably about 12 million Muslims, and according to Turkish sources, there were about 3 million non-Muslims, including, of course, Greeks, who were even larger than Armenians on the World War I.
Yeah,
Question and then question.
I wonder if the doctor is still alive.
Unfortunately, Dr. Karayan passed away about a year ago.
Oh.
He knew the book was coming out. He published a lot of his material in his lifetime in journals, but as a book form and in its final form, we published it, but it's his work, so we didn't take license, we did it the way he wanted it to be published.
And also, my grandparents from both sides are from Edirne. Edirne was
Yes.
in the European.
Yes.
Okay, and during the first Armenian massacres, my grandparents fled to Bulgaria. So why we're not including those losses in the? Why we're only talking about 2013 to 2000? I mean, around the
Okay.
World War I.
Okay, from Edirne, you said your parents.
Yeah.
Actually, well, Edirne is up at the top,
In
and
the European part.
in the European, but and of course during the genocide, the Armenians of Edirne were also, and Rodosto, they were also subject to genocidal policy. Even in Constantinople, the local Armenians were not deported and killed, but many Armenians who were there from outside were arrested. They were actually exiled. All right. So, but Edirne is right at the top. In fact, the top left-hand corner is a small Armenian community, and the destruction of that community is also very interesting because they were so far away. They were less than probably 5% of the population of that area, and they were also subject to genocidal policy.
But the number is not included in the other numbers that Dr. Karayan can.
I'll be honest with you, I have to check that one now because I also was concentrating on the east,
Yeah.
but I think it was included by him.
Question here and then over here.
Just out of curiosity, do they have any record of how many Turks? Because I remember my dad saying that, and he was from Sivas, that they killed their fair share of Turks. But
Armenians, you mean?
Well, I mean Turkish people. I mean, he said his dad had gone off to fight and never came home. But at the same time, I mean, he said his comment was that we killed Turks too.
Okay. During the First World War, of course, many Turks perished because of the war itself. When Armenians, this is semi-taboo amongst Armenians, but when Armenians occupied parts of eastern Turkey, there were cases of massacres carried out by Armenians. I mean, that is recorded. It's understudied. The numbers, you said the fair share. I'm not sure it's as large as you might suggest. I mean, in Turkish historiography, that number has been pushed into millions. There's absolutely nothing of the sort. There were individual cases of massacres, and I personally would never justify it, but what happened after the genocide, as the Russians went forward, many Armenian many Armenian volunteers who went with the Russians, when they went back to their home villages and they saw what had happened before, they also committed atrocities, which obviously you don't want to be in the position to defend. But what are the numbers? We're not sure. There were some in Erzincan, but they were usually much further east. Sivas area, I think it's very little
I would
Armenian
imagine
activity.
it was more in defense as opposed to going out and trying to kill people.
There were cases of defense, like in Shabin Karahisar, where Armenians defended themselves, but there were cases where, when these areas were occupied, there were individual cases of massacre. But I mean, that's something you can't control during wartime.
So that can, yeah, can we come back and then we'll come back? Yeah, we'll come back.
What motivated Dr. Karayan to do this study? And what Derazi is he, and where did he immigrate to?
Dr. Karayan,
America.
as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Karayan did this study because he wanted to answer the question, how do we know 1.5 million Armenians perished during World War I? And in order to do that, he had to figure out how many Armenians were living there in the first place, 1914, and then how many were still alive, or how many Armenians were alive in 1925. He's an Aintab, and in his book, he actually makes a case study of Aintab in comparing Turkish Armenian sources, but he's from Aintab.
In practice where? In the East Coast?
He was from Lebanon, and then in the East Coast, yeah. No, West Coast, I'm sorry. West Coast, Los Angeles.
In the back? And then in the front?
Is there any mention in this book about an obscure, let's say, subset of Armenians called the Hromahais, Roman or Byzantine Armenians? That's one. And also, did he mention anything about Islamicized Armenians who had even Islamicized prior to the 1895 massacres?
Right. He does talk about Romahai in Western Turkey, where the sources mention them, so there is that category. Islamicized Armenians, no, he doesn't look into the fate. When we say, well, how many Armenians perished, he's looking at how many Armenians were living in 1914 and how many Armenians were counted in, say, 1925. So those Armenians, think about women and children who were abducted, who were absorbed into Muslim families during World War I. Technically, they were not murdered. But in Karayan's figures, they will be counted as being among the losses. Today, we know that hundreds of thousands such victims, there were such victims. In my calculation, about 10% of Armenians were not actually killed, but they were actually absorbed in a systematic manner, that the state took, especially women and children, some were put in state orphanages, they were assimilated, they were Turkified, they were given Turkish names, and they were farmed out. So assimilation was part of the genocidal process. He doesn't distinguish with that because that's not part of his study. He's dealing with statistics alone. That's something separate.
I was talking about, for example, the 1870s, even until before the Hamidian massacres. Just villages just decided we're going to change for some either obscure reasons, political reasons, economic, or what have you.
The answer is no. One can do those studies because he was only interested how many Armenians were there by 1914 and know how that figure was derived, what the losses in the different massacres, Armenian, Adan, and so forth. Those are different. I mean, you can expand these studies. He was looking, well, how do we know that there were, for argument's sake, 2.5 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire? And this is the first time that we have a more systematic thesis. Right? All these subjects are interesting, and as I was saying in the beginning, history writing process is in our hands. If we do this type of study, we'll have that kind of information. It hasn't been done. It's been done in a haphazard manner, piecemeal manner. Maybe this is where communities can put pressure on academics to address these issues. Right? Because academics will only do what interests them. But if you put pressure on them, or you show interest in specific types of questions, then they might be more likely to address them.
And over here, Carl. Yeah.
You know how we calculated the loss of Armenian lives after 1918?
But good question. How how did he calculate loss of Armenian lives after 1918? He used different sources, specific reported it's in the book. Specific massacres, say in the Hajin Adana region of Kemalis, in the Pontic area, on the Black Sea coast. The number of people killed is in the first Turkish onslaught in the Caucasus, 1918, up to Sardarabad battle. So he actually gives those figures, and he gives his sources why he thinks those are the numbers. So he allows his thesis to be falsified.
So
The way,
it was the main vilayets then, it was the
excuse me?
outskirts. It was in the outskirts.
But the thing is, what is difficult to say is because so many Armenians had moved also during the genocide to the Caucasus. Now, what happened to those? So he's trying to distinguish what was happening in different population groups as they were moving and how they were lost. So, but in the book, he's addressing those points as well. So not only in aggregate terms, but specific losses. So how do you divide the losses between 15 and 18, and then 18 and 21, and 21 and 23? Any
Other questions?
Thank you, Ara. This is a valuable, very valuable work. What he's published, Armenians in Ottoman Turkey, 1914. It's a valuable work as he's demonstrated. It's part of the continuing publications throughout the world that have giving us more insight into the Armenian genocide. So I want to thank Ara. He came to California. He spoke in Los Angeles. He's speaking in Fresno, and then he's going to.
St. Leon.
He's going back to the diocese to speak at the diocese in Burbank tomorrow, and then he'll be returning to London. But we want to support people like Ara Sarafian, who are publishing works which are valuable not only for Armenians but the entire world of historiography. That is, these works, when they get out into the general world of history and historiography, make a great contribution to the study of the Armenian genocide. I just want to remind you that next week, Thursday night, will be Dr. Richard Hovhannisyan. He'll be speaking at the Charles and Alice Gurevian Armenian Cultural Center. It's the 100th anniversary of Hominid Men, and we're co-sponsoring with Hominid Men and Hamaskain, and that is downtown at 7:30 p.m. And then on Friday night, November the 2nd, we're going to be showing the movie Roots as part of Cineculture, and that's in our other place here on campus called the Peters Educational Center Auditorium, which is in the Save Mart Center. You're all welcome to join us at 5:30 p.m. I'd like to invite you to enjoy some cookies and coffee. Thank you to Hamaskain for providing the cookies, but also come out and speak to Ara, and we have the books out on sale if you'd like to purchase a book. Thank you for your attention. We'll see you next Thursday. Thank you.